Hi, and thanks for watching our presentation. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm a professor with the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University. This work is being done with Trip Harris, a PhD student in that program. This presentation was delivered at the annual meeting of the Assessment Institute at IUPUI on October 11th, 2022. So today, I'm going to talk about transforming online grading, assessment, and testing, and I'm going to present a rather different approach than many of you are probably familiar with. And this approach is really grounded in newer situative theories of cognition. I want to thank sponsors of this work, Stacy Maroney in particular, currently the Dean of the School of Education in Bloomington, but as the VP of Learning Technologies, several internal grants that supported this work. Mike Beam, Assistant VP for School Partnerships. This work has been done in close collaboration with Indiana University High School. Rebecca Ito, formerly PhD student, currently principal, and graduate students Grant Chartrand and Morgan Lau. So many of you are probably familiar with this idea of sort of mainstream assessment, sort of knowing what students know from the National Research Council. Sort of a cognitive perspective on assessment, the so-called assessment triangle consisting of observation, interpretation, cognition, and concerns about using assessments for multiple purposes. This approach has recently been automated in a program called Evidence-Centered Design, associated with Smarter Balance Assessment Coalition, which has recently been included actually in Indiana's iLearn, this sort of computer adaptive tests. And this is consistent with most other, they call them often alternative or authentic approaches, Wiggins backwards design, Black and Williams formative assessment, Popham's what teachers need to know. I'm going to present an alternative to the alternative. Um, so waves of assessment reforms have come and gone since 1990. My work was really shaped by my experience at ETS, at the Center for Performance Assessment, when I went to work at the center to support these sort of new alternative assessments, and they kind of evaporated in about a year in 1994, and that really sort of led me to think really hard about alternative ways, and that's really what I've been focusing on throughout my career. Uh, and I moved into online instruction in 2009. And so what I'm going to show you today is really the latest where we're at in terms of using this approach online. And briefly, I'll just say that situative theory, if you're not familiar with it, really it's a sort of extremely sociocultural perspective, and it really provides a broader view of the nature of knowing and learning. And one of the advantages of it is it offers new ways of thinking about sort of old challenges. Here are the challenges that we're addressing in our work. One is just that doing online summative testing. There's a lot of challenges. Now, you don't want to reduce courses to test prep. When your online tests become very salient indicators of what is valued. Um, Real problem with open book exams, right? You can open book exams uh, mean that people can look up answers, and students do. Most students know. I think that a lot of instructors aren't aware of how much students are sort of skipping the instructions and going straight to the exams and just waiting until they get to a open book unlimited time exam and just looking everything up, and that reduces uh, a course to basically what can be tested, and that's a shallow representation of a course. And assessment is just a sample of what students learn and not everything. Now, LMSs automate testing. In many cases, they require proctoring. Now, one of the things that's happening right now is that Indiana University High School and IU Online are both abandoning um, using proctors, and we are providing an example course using the framework I'm going to show you today as a pilot to present an alternative for doing that. Proctors, students and faculty hate them. IU is being sued, I believe, for the fact that they discriminate against students of color and because they're very intrusive. And the problem is they can be bypassed, right? This has been all over the news. Heard about it. If you go on the web, you'll see that there's lots of people offering to help you cheat on proctor exams. The second challenge we're addressing is sort of what I call the burden of portfolio assessment. Many of the calls in the pandemic for alternative assessments were for, moving past traditional exams. Well, a lot of those people who were calling for that weren't the people who were going to be spending hours and hours reviewing portfolios for evidence of what someone knows based on what they did. Um, it's typically done in private. Students expect full points, and if they don't get full points, they want detailed justification for every point deduction. And they also, students, if the stakes are high for a portfolio, students will demand sort of individualized feedback on all their interim artifacts. Like, is this what you want? Did I do it right? And then there's really serious issues with validity and fairness. This gets deep into the validity issues I don't have time to get into. I did write about it quite a bit in the paper I'll talk about in a second. It's hard to know who did the work. A lot of times parents will help with students' work, and there's evidence that racial bias will creep in to scoring. And then finally, there's the conundrum of formative assessment. I've written about this pretty extensively. I agree that formative assessment is effective, but it's really laborious. The pedagogical content knowledge needed to give individualized formative feedback, it's expensive. You need a lot of talent to do it, and it cuts into instructor time for more effective public feedback. And again, you can really end up focusing much too narrowly on the shallow representations of knowledge on an assessment. And then when you go online, everything's harder because technological pedagogical content knowledge is particularly costly. In response, we've written the article that's the core of our talk today. This was published in 2021 in Distance Education. And so there's a link at the bottom of the page where you can access this article yourself. And I'm basically going to overview this article and encourage you to consider following this model and referring to this article for further details. The example context I'm going to use is a class called Assessment in Schools that I've been teaching online since 2009. I did teach this as a big open online course for hundreds of learners, refined several features, and was able to do this with hundreds of learners without extra help. One of the important points about this course is I teach it in the summer. I'm often traveling. I'm quite busy. So it really pushed me to make the best use of my time as possible. And that's really the centerpiece of this approach is minimizing private instructor-student interaction and maximizing public interaction. And we do this with 4 levels of assessment. These are increasingly formal levels. Again, these are detailed in the paper. Quickly, I'll just say that at the immediate level, ungraded assessments of instructor discourse is just me commenting on student work, assessing learning that's happening in a very brief time scale of minutes to hours, and then close level graded assessment. So when students complete their assignments, they reflect on it in a very carefully structured way. These are summative assessments of their prior engagement, but formative assessments of their understanding. Right, so this is different than a cognitive perspective that argues against using the same assessment for multiple purposes. A situative perspective allows a broader view of learning that for both the close level and then at the proximal level, they're doing double duty. So I have formative self-assessments at the end of each assignment that require students to transfer their knowledge from the assignments to a more formal assessment. So those are summative assessments of their understanding from the assignment, but formative assessments of their achievement on the final exam. I'll be going back through examples of each of them. And finally, at the end of each module, in this case, 3 modules, is a automated achievement test. I take full advantage of that nice feature of the LMS. I assume that students will search for answers, so I give pretty challenging questions that students can't possibly find the answer, and I include best answer items. Again, I'll go back over that. So in this class, Morgan is one of my doctoral advisees who's given me permission to use her work. So each student in each assignment in this class, they generate a unique curricular aim and context, and they use that. In this case, this assignment is learning how to create short answer items, and you can see that she's created a short answer item for a personally relevant instructional goal. I've gone in and publicly examined her work and commented on it. This is this first level immediate assessment. I'm assessing her engagement in the assignment, and we had this nice exchange that I'll return to an important point about that it embodies an important principle in this design. I'm positioning Morgan as the expert. She knows more about this particular issue than I do. At the end of each assignment, uh, students are asked to reflect on their engagement. Now, reflecting a situative perspective, again, this is a summative assessment of their engagement, right? They can't really write these reflections if they didn't do the work. They can't write a coherent one. But in reflecting on their work, they're thinking more deeply about the concepts that they learned. But these are formative in another way. There's a notion in situative theory called prolepsis, and that is the way that the future shapes the present. Because the students know that they're going to have to reflect on these features of their assignment, they're much more inclined to focus on those features while they're completing the assignment. So for instance, contextual engagement. Um, how well suited was your curricular aim for completing this assignment? Well, that's a kind of a complicated thing at first, but once they've taken the time to reflect on it and gotten feedback from me as their instructor when they submitted, they're much more likely to think about that while they're working on subsequent assignments because, again, they're going to know that they have to reflect. Here you can see Morgan's reflection on that particular assignment. It helped me learn more about the constructed response indeed, right? So this is what I mean. In the collaborative engagement, you can see them signaling their friends who they learned stuff from. So that is the second of the levels. Again, that is a close level. So we're assessing learning over the scale of the assignment. This is learning that happens, probably over a time scale of a day or so. Moving on to the third level. This is the proximal self-assessment. It is proximal to the curriculum, right? So we're asking specific questions about things that occurred in the curriculum. Um, but it's a little bit removed, right? So it's a little more formal. And so here you can see one of the questions, and what you see below is the sort of expert response. Now, the instructions assessment are really important. We tell them you should be able to write an acceptable answer, right? So we tell them if you've engaged in the assignment, you should know the answer to this. If you don't, you cut some corners. Regardless, try to write a complete answer. If you have to, go back and look in the book for more information, even on the web. Then compare your answer with that expert answer explanation. You've got the students at a perfect moment. You've focused all their attention on an important concept, right? You've got, 5 or 6 of these at the end of each assignment. So that is the proximal self-assessments level. Moving on to the fourth level, these are summative exam items, right? So they've got 2 minutes to answer this item. Now, I have gone through and made sure that you can't, uh, that the answers to these items don't appear on the web. Now, one issue is that any items from test banks, which is where these originated from, they end up in cheater sites. So you have to reword the items, both the answer and the stem. And notice how you'd have to look up, they're backwards. The answer isn't in the item. You can't ask the question STEM and get the answer from Google, and it won't appear at the bottom of the page where it says students are also asking. In other words, they would have to look up each one of those things and reason back to the STEM, and that's an almost impossible thing to do in 2 minutes, and it really advantages the students who completed the assignments. So those are the levels. Now, what we elaborate on in the paper quite a bit, which I think is probably the most helpful thing. I don't have time to really dig into these. They're fairly complicated. They probably really won't make sense until you try uh, to, to, to implement this thing. But I'm just going to very quickly review each of them. The first one, really complicated. It has to do with situative theory, but it basically says we can treat all assessments as special cases of disciplinary discourse. This gets you out of these debates over different assessment formats. You're looking at all of them through a discursive lens, like, are you fostering productive forms of disciplinary discourse in your assessment practice? You want to focus on assessment functions. This is the second principle, right? So the second and third levels were both formative and summative assessments. Principle 3 is you want to synergize multiple complementary types of interaction, right? So there's public interaction, in the public space. Then there's local interaction. That's where I'm interacting with students, specific students in public, giving them comments, but everybody can see it. Then there's private interaction. That's the students interacting with the self-assessment. That's entirely private. And then discrete is a special kind of private interaction. It's one that I've added to emphasize the fact that you really want to downplay those summative assessments. Don't make them worth a lot of points. Don't get students to focus on them. Just convince students that if they complete the assignment and the formative assessment, they'll do fine on the exams. And the exam is just kind of a gatekeeper. Then 4, you want to align learning across increasingly formal assessments, right? So that learning was occurring at these increasingly formal timescales, right? From hours to days to weeks to months across the entire term. And this is this idea that you're transforming learning across each of those levels. And so students are required to transfer their knowledge at each level. And that's what both ensures learning while protecting the validity of the summative assessment. 5, embrace transformative functions. There's a fantastic article that I've referenced in my paper um, that introduces this notion of transformative assessment. It's work out of the UK. The author's name is suddenly escaping me, but it's this idea that you want to transform in a positive way rather than deform. A lot of assessment practices have a deformative function in that they reduce knowledge down to a sort of crude representations of that knowledge, and you don't want that to happen. So this is a relatively complicated slide, but it really captures all of these 5 principles, right? So you've got these levels. Notice at interaction, right? You go from public to local to private to discrete. Now, what's changing there is the orientation of the assessment at each level, right? At the immediate level, they're oriented to interactions, then you're oriented toward the activities, then the curriculum, and then to standards. So you're zooming out in the orientation of the assessment. The assessments become increasingly formal across levels because they assess learning at increasingly longer time scales. Number 6, you want to position learners as accountable authors. My work is fundamentally shaped by the work of the late Randy Engel. And so you want to insistently position students as the experts in the intersection of their own interests and the course content. And in doing so, you want to reposition minoritized learners for equitable engagement. I will be presenting this afternoon at 2:45. This is Tuesday, on October 12th, um, a new framework called Culturally Sustaining Educational Assessment that really focuses on what this looks like. So I won't say too much more other than saying if you include socio-political controversies as optional parts of your assignments, you invite minoritized students to position themselves as having unique expertise uh, in that area. I showed this earlier. I wanted you to take a look at this. Now, see what I'm opening by saying super interesting. I always assume, so I'm looking for opportunities at the close level to basically profess my ignorance and learn from my students. Every opportunity I get is I elevate their expertise um, to learn from it, right? So this is what I mean by positioning students as authors. They have authority. They're authoring new knowledge because they have unique expertise that they bring to bear. So I'll say a little bit about this, quite a bit of discussion about alternative assessment during the pandemic. Um, and the big debate is, do achievement tests reproduce racist and colonial representations of the disciplines? Now, I'm very influenced by Django Paris's work, where he argues that culturally sustaining education should celebrate and take advantage of the cultural and linguistic diversity that students bring to the classroom, but nonetheless give them access to majoritized ways of knowing, because there's these gatekeepers. They're called tests. They're not going away. All students need to be able to use their knowledge in traditional ways to gain access to employment and educational opportunities. And so this is a much bigger debate that I'll talk about more this afternoon. Number 8, you want to enhance the validity of evidence, right? So these last 3 principles are about validity. I am a validity theorist. I've studied validity for all my career. Um, right, so you want to make sure, again, that the summative assessments are not easily searchable. You want to use the LMS quiz tool to look at the D, or the discrimination function, to make sure that items function as they should. Um, so you want to be sure that the scores that students get on your summative exam really do reflect valid evidence, right? So in this case, this is what, if you haven't used this before, Canvas makes it really easy, not only to make sure that that students who do well on an individual item do well overall, but you also can look at how the distractors function. Then 9 and 10, so you want to advance the credibility of scores and efficiency for educators, right? So those previous scores were sort of validity if you're doing research or you're being held accountable to higher standards by your institution. But you also want, for the educators, enhance the credibility in the scores and efficiency for educators. And so the way that principle works is that by grading student portfolios for engagement rather than knowledge, right? So you're not getting into this messy business of making claims of what students know from what they did. Rather, you're relying on your summative exams to do what they do well, and you're relying on your more informal portfolio assessment practice to support engagement and learning. And then finally, you want to enhance credibility of assessment and grades for learners, right? So by aligning learning across levels, as I've showed you, students really do believe, right? Now, one of the issues that I face, and that you'll face if you follow this approach, is that I suggest that your average scores on your summative exam be between 70 and 80%. That means your average student might be getting 75% correct. And a lot of students, they see that as a C, and they want to argue about it. And you say, no, 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 no. You only lost 2.5 points out of 100. You're doing just fine. That's very good. So, and because they see the relationship between the formative and the summative assessment, they're basically they're okay with that. So what you really want to get out of is arguing with students over every single point in their portfolio. As you know, that can be really time consuming, and it's just not a good use of time. A lot of times, students aren't really arguing about knowing something, they just have been trained to argue for more points, and you want to try to avoid that. So again, the paper was published in Distance Education. There's the resource page there at the bottom, bit.ly, IUHSA assessment. I'll leave that up there for a second. And here are several other papers that are on that landing page. Um, the second paper there is a very straightforward paper that was written for educators about the larger approach to online learning that this assessment is embedded in. It's a very entry-level piece. The third paper is a more theoretical paper that shows how we transformed our design principles into step-by-step instruction. Um, and then the last two are much more theoretical papers really written for the research community. Thanks for listening to my talk. And if you have any questions, you can email me at dthickey. Thanks a lot.